There's a lake deep in the forest near my childhood home, one that locals avoid at all costs. They call it Willow Lake, though no one remembers why. It's quiet there, too quiet. Birds don't sing, and the water's surface is unnervingly still, like a polished mirror. When I was a kid, my friends used to dare each other to go there at night. I never did, not even once. I had heard the stories about the woman who drowned there, about the whispers that call to you if you get too close, about the people who don't come back. I thought I'd escaped Willow Lake when I moved away, but now, 20 years later, I've returned. And this time, I can't ignore its pull. My name is Clara, and I've always hated the forest. While other kids loved running through the trees, playing hide and seek and building forts, I felt uneasy under the shadow of the pines. It wasn't just the darkness or the way the air seemed heavier among the trees, it was the lake. Willow Lake was the kind of place that seemed to breathe, like it had a life of its own. My mother used to tell me stories about it, sitting by the fire on stormy nights. "There's a lady in that lake," she'd say, her voice low and serious. "People say she was a bride who drowned on her wedding night. Others say she was a witch, punished for cursing the town. Either way, she's there, and she's angry. You can hear her crying if you listen closely." I always thought my mother was just trying to scare me, but the older I got, the more I realized the town believed it too. No one went near the lake, not even the hunters or fishermen. It was a place of silence and fear, a place where bad things happened. When I left for college, I swore I'd never come back. But life has a way of pulling you back to the places you want to forget. I returned to Willow Creek last week after my mother passed away. The house was still the same, small, weathered, and surrounded by trees. It smelled like dust and memories, and I couldn't decide if it felt comforting or suffocating. As I unpacked, I found one of my mother's old notebooks tucked away in a drawer. It was filled with stories about the lake, legends, warnings, even sketches of the drowned lady. One page caught my eye, a map of the forest with Willow Lake circled in red. Beneath it, she had written one word: beware. I should have listened. The first night back, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, and every creak of the floorboards set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint sound, like someone crying. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, until it was unmistakably a woman's voice. It was coming from the direction of the lake. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets over my head like I was a kid again, but the crying didn't stop. Finally, I got up and looked out the window. The forest was dark, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I couldn't see the lake, but the sound seemed to seep through the air, chilling me to the bone. The next morning, I told myself it had been a dream, but as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I decided to go into town to clear my head. Willow Creek hadn't changed much, same dusty roads, same tired faces. But when I mentioned the lake, the shopkeeper's expression darkened. "You'd do well to stay away from there," she said, her voice low. "Why?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "It's cursed," she said simply. "People go there and don't come back." I wanted to ask more, but her tone made it clear the conversation was over. That night, the crying came back. It was louder this time, more desperate. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I threw on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and headed into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, their branches reaching out like twisted arms. The air grew colder, and the sound of the crying grew louder with every step. When I reached the lake, I stopped in my tracks. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of glass. And there, at the center of the lake, was a figure. She was barely visible, her form shrouded in mist. Her long hair floated around her like seaweed, and her pale skin seemed to glow in the moonlight. She was facing away from me, but I could feel her sadness, her pain, radiating from across the water. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, and my breath caught in my throat. Her face was hauntingly beautiful, but her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pierce straight through me. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice echoing across the lake. I heard you crying," I stammered. Her expression twisted into something unrecognizable, anger, despair, and something else I couldn't place. "Leave," she said, her voice rising. "Leave now before it's too late." That evening, I went through my mother's notebook again, searching for answers. One entry stood out. "The drowned lady is not what she seems. She cries for her loss, but beware her wrath. Do not look into the water. Do not answer her call." I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling, but it was too late. I had already answered. Desperate for answers, I went back into town. This time, I sought out Mr. Carter, the oldest resident of Willow Creek. He lived alone in a crumbling house on the edge of town, and the locals said he knew everything about the lake. When I told him about the woman, his face turned ashen. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who is she?" I asked. He sighed, sinking into his chair. "No one knows for sure. Some say she was a bride who drowned on her wedding day. Others say she was a healer accused of witchcraft, but one thing's certain, she's bound to that lake and she won't rest until she's free." "How can she be freed?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with fear. "No one knows, but those who try..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "They don't come back." That night, I dreamed of the lake. I was standing at the edge, the water lapping at my feet. The woman was there, her eyes fixed on me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice soft and pleading. I woke with a start, the sound of her voice echoing in my mind. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to go back. There was something about her, something that felt familiar, like a memory I couldn't quite grasp. The next morning, I packed a bag and headed into the forest. This time, I wasn't sure if I'd be coming back. I don't know why I went back to the lake. Maybe it was curiosity or guilt or something deeper. Something that felt like her voice was inside my head, pulling me toward her. Whatever it was, I couldn't ignore it. I packed a flashlight, my mother's notebook, and a thermos of coffee. The forest felt different this time, quieter, darker. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and every step felt like I was walking deeper into something I couldn't escape. When I reached the lake, the water was no longer still. It rippled gently, as if something beneath the surface was moving. The woman was there again, standing at the center of the lake. Her figure was clearer now, her pale skin almost glowing in the dim light. Her hair floated around her like a halo, and her eyes, they were no longer empty. They were filled with sorrow. "You came back," she said, her voice soft but resonant. I don't know why," I admitted, my voice trembling. She tilted her head, studying me. "You carry their blood," she said cryptically. Whose blood? She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand, her fingers long and delicate, and pointed toward the water's edge. Look, she said. I hesitated, but something compelled me to obey. I stepped closer, peering into the water. At first, all I saw was my reflection. But then the surface rippled, and an image appeared, a memory, vivid and haunting. I saw my mother, younger and vibrant, standing at the lake's edge. She was holding something, a bundle wrapped in a white cloth. The image shifted, and I realized the bundle was a baby. What is this? I whispered, my heart pounding. The woman didn't answer. The vision continued, showing my mother wading into the water, the bundle clutched tightly to her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. And then she stopped. The water reached her waist and she unwrapped the bundle, revealing me. I gasped, stepping back. That's not possible, I stammered. That can't be real. The woman's expression didn't change. You were marked, she said simply. Marked for what? To finish what she started, she said. The vision faded, leaving me shaken. My mother had never spoken about Willow Lake beyond the stories, and now I realized why. She'd tried to hide something that involved me. I returned to the house, desperate for answers. I searched every drawer, every closet, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen. Finally, I found it, a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. Inside was an old journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. The entries were short and fragmented, written in my mother's neat handwriting. The lady in the lake called to me. I didn't understand why, but I couldn't ignore her. She said the child was hers, that I had taken her. I tried to give her back, but something stopped me. The lake wouldn't let me leave. Clara is marked. The lady will come for her. The final entry was smeared, the ink running as if it had been soaked in water. But I could still make out the words. Beware the water, beware the call. That night, I dreamed of the lake again. The woman's voice echoed in my mind, soft and melodic. Come to me, she said, bring what was taken. When I woke, my body was drenched in sweat, and my hands ached, as if I'd been gripping something tightly. I looked down and saw my mother's journal still clutched in my hands. The pages were damp, though I had no idea how. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a story. It was real, and it wasn't going to stop until I did something about it. I went back to Mr. Carter the next morning, the journal clutched in my hands. He opened the door slowly, his face pale and drawn. I told you to stay away, he said. I need answers, I said firmly. You know more than you're telling me. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the journal. Finally, he sighed and stepped aside, letting me in. Your mother was one of them, he said, sinking into his chair. One of who? The women the lake called, he said. It's been happening for generations. Always the same. A woman hears the call, goes to the lake, and comes back. Different. Different how? They carry the mark, he said. It's not visible, but it's there, and it gets passed down from mother to child. I stared at him, my mind racing. What does the mark mean? He shook his head. No one knows. But the lady in the lake, she's always looking for something, and once she sets her sights on you, she doesn't let go. I left Mr. Carter's house, more confused than ever. If my mother had been marked, and I was marked too, what did that mean? What did the lady in the lake want from me? I spent the rest of the day researching, combing through old town records and newspaper articles. Most of it was useless. Stories of strange disappearances, rumors of hauntings, but one article stood out. It was about a woman named Eleanor Whitmore who had drowned in Willow Lake over a century ago. She was young, wealthy, and engaged to be married, but on the night before her wedding she vanished. Her body was found days later, floating in the lake. The coroner's report was strange. Her lungs were filled with water, but there were no signs of struggle. It was as if she had walked into the lake willingly. The article included a photograph of Eleanor, and my blood ran cold. She was the woman in the lake. I returned to the lake that evening, the photograph clutched in my hand. The forest was eerily quiet, and the air felt heavy, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. When I reached the water's edge, the woman was already there, waiting for me. "You know who I am now," she said, her voice calm and measured. "Eleanor," I said, my voice shaking. "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" Her expression softened, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of humanity in her eyes. "I didn't choose this," she said. "I was taken, just like the others. The lake, it binds us." "Why me?" I asked. "Because you carry the mark," she said simply. "You are the key to breaking the curse." I wanted to run, to escape the weight of her words, but I couldn't. Something rooted me to the spot, her gaze holding me captive. "What do I have to do?" I asked. She stepped closer, the water rippling around her. "You must return what was taken," she said. "Only then will I be free." "What does that mean?" I demanded. "What was taken?" Her expression darkened. "You'll find it in the forest," she said. "But beware, others guard it, and they will not let you pass easily." Before I could ask more, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the mist. "Wait," I called out. "How will I know what to look for?" Her voice echoed faintly as she disappeared. "You'll know." I stood there for a long time, staring at the lake, the photograph still clutched in my hand. The forest around me felt alive, its shadows shifting and writhing, as if waiting for me to take the first step. Whatever lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. The lake wouldn't let me go until I found what it wanted. I stood there, the locket no longer in my hand, watching as the lake returned to its unnatural stillness. The burst of light that had erupted when the locket hit the water had faded, leaving behind only silence. I wanted to believe it was over, that Eleanor had been freed, and that whatever curse had gripped Willow Lake was finally gone. But the forest didn't feel different. It still watched me, silent and expectant, as though waiting for what came next. I turned away from the lake and began walking back toward the house. Each step felt heavier than the last. My body ached, and my thoughts were muddled. My mother's journal, the visions of Eleanor, the drowned, they swirled together in my mind like a storm I couldn't escape. I wanted answers, but more than that, I wanted to leave. To get away from this cursed place and never look back. But as I neared the edge of the forest, a sound stopped me in my tracks. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A laugh, high-pitched and childlike, it echoed through the trees, coming from the direction of the lake. My breath hitched, and I froze, straining to hear. It came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, small, quick, and getting closer. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beams swept across the trees, illuminating nothing but shadows. "Who's there?" My voice was hoarse, barely louder than a whisper. There was no response. The forest was still, the laughter gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, every muscle in my body taut. Then as I started to turn away, I saw it, a small figure darting between the trees just at the edge of the light. It was too fast to make out, but it was there. I wasn't alone. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stumbled back toward the house, not daring to look behind me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking and my mind raced with questions. Who or what had been in the forest, and why did it feel like they were following me? I forced myself to move, pacing the living room as I tried to make sense of everything. My mother's journal sat on the coffee table, its pages worn and yellowed. I opened it again, flipping through the entries in search of something I'd missed. One page caught my eye, a drawing of the lake with figures emerging from the water. Beneath it, my mother had written a single sentence. The lake demands balance. Balance. The word sent a chill down my spine. What had Eleanor said? That the lake had a will of its own, that it took what it wanted and didn't let go. I thought returning the locket would end it, but what if it wasn't enough? What if the lake wanted something more? The thought filled me with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still tied to the lake, that it wasn't done with me yet. I tried to push the thought aside, telling myself I was just imagining things. But that night, as I lay in bed, the sound of laughter returned, faint and distant, but unmistakable. The next morning, I decided to go back into town. I needed to know more, and I hoped someone, anyone, could give me answers. Mr. Carter's house was my first stop, but when I knocked on the door, there was no response. The curtains were drawn, and the house felt abandoned. I called his name, but the only answer was silence. The next morning, I decided to go back into town. I needed to know more, and I hoped someone, anyone, could give me answers. Mr. Carter's house was my first stop, but when I knocked on the door, there was no response. The curtains were drawn, and the house felt abandoned. I called his name, but the only answer was silence. I turned to leave, but a movement caught my eye. A piece of paper was stuck to the window, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I stepped closer and read the hastily scrawled words. "Leave now. It's not safe." The warning sent a jolt of fear through me. I looked around, half expecting to see the drowned emerging from the shadows, but the street was empty. Still, the message was clear. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over, and it was getting worse. I spent the rest of the day at the library poring over old records and newspapers. Most of what I found was useless. Speculation about the lake, superstitions passed down through generations. But one article stood out. It was from 1923 and detailed a series of disappearances near Willow Lake. The victims were all children, and none of them were ever found. The article described strange occurrences, unexplained laughter, shadows moving in the trees, and whispers that seemed to come from the water itself. The final paragraph sent a chill through me. The townsfolk believe the lake is cursed, that it takes the young as payment for a wrong committed long ago. Until the balance is restored, the lake will continue to claim its victims. Balance. The word echoed in my mind, heavy with meaning. I thought of the laughter I'd heard, the small figure in the woods. Was the lake coming for me? Or was it coming for someone else? I left the library as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in shadows. The walk back to my mother's house felt longer than usual, every sound amplified in the growing darkness. By the time I reached the front door, my nerves were frayed and my hands shook as I unlocked it. Inside, the air felt heavy, suffocating. I turned on every light, trying to chase away the unease that had settled over me. But it didn't help. The laughter started again, louder this time, echoing through the house. I spun around, searching for the source, but the rooms were empty. Then I saw it. A small, wet footprint on the wooden floor, leading toward the back door. My heart raced as I followed the trail, my flashlight sweeping the room. The footprint stopped at the door, and beyond it, the forest loomed, dark and impenetrable. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stay inside. But something compelled me to move, to step outside and follow the trail. The air was cold, biting against my skin as I ventured into the woods. The laughter grew louder, guiding me deeper and deeper until I reached the lake. The water was restless, rippling as though something beneath the surface was stirring. And then I saw her. A child, standing at the edge of the water, her back to me. Her hair was dark and matted, her dress tattered and soaked. She turned slowly, and my breath caught in my throat. Her eyes were empty, hollow pits that seemed to swallow the light. She smiled, a twisted, unnatural expression that sent a wave of terror through me. "Why are you here?" I managed to whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed to the water. I followed her gaze and saw them, the drowned, their pale faces just visible beneath the surface. They stared up at me, their eyes filled with a silent plea. The child stepped closer, her small hand reaching for mine. "Come," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "They're waiting." I stumbled back, my mind racing. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I can't." Her smile faded, replaced by an expression of sadness. "If you don't, they'll come for you," she said simply. The water rippled again, and the drowned began to rise, their forms breaking the surface. I turned and ran, the sound of their movement echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the house, slamming the door shut and collapsing against it. The lake wasn't done with me, and I didn't know if I had the strength to face it,